Welcome to our continuing stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city, the City of Five Flags. In this episode, we begin a series of stories about Pensacola, its people, and the nation in World War II. Now, to begin with, let's take a quick look at what Pensacola and Escambia County were like as of themselves. We were a community of about 75,000 people. Most of the general commerce was along Palafox and Garden Streets downtown. We had the Sears and Penny's stores. We had 4 fine motion picture theaters. We had one radio station, WCOA, and 2 newspapers, morning and afternoon. The people here also, many of them, subscribed to magazines such as Life and Look that were giving world pictures of what was going on across the entire world. And people here were really kind of conscious of what was going on as far as war was concerned. They had followed, through these various media, they had followed what had gone on beginning in the 1930s in Germany, as Germany rearmed, and then they followed the stories of what Hitler and his armies had done in Poland and across the entire western part of Europe as they stormed through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, posed a threat to Great Britain, and then of course they had everyone here hung on pins and cushions, if you will, when the exodus from Dunkirk was taking place. But people here were aware of all of this. They also were following what was happening on the other side of the earth, as the Japanese, beginning early in the 1930s, had begun their invasions of Manchuria and then into China. And I suspect that many people here had a pretty good idea of what the Japanese emperor looked like. So people were involved. They understood what was going on, although it is doubtful that many people here were certain that we were going to be in a war. At the Naval Air Station, that probably was not the case. People there were in a stage of rebuilding. More pilots were being trained. And I suspect if we had eavesdropped among the coffee drinkers at the Child Restaurant or the B&B, we would have heard some people saying, well, it's only a matter of time that we're going to become involved some way. And that's probably the way they were thinking as well. Now, what was the community itself like? Well, the Depression was just winding down. The community had returned to the community chest just a couple of years before. Our school system had just been evaluated. We had 84 schools across the county with about 15,000 students and a total budget, and that's a kind of an interesting figure to look at today, a total education budget of just under $1 million for the entire year for all purposes concurred. We had a growing number of automobiles and trucks in the community. All told, the tax collector that year had sold 14,000 license plates for residential and commercial use, and basically the federal courthouse and the county courthouse were had just completed the exchange that they had, because in 1939 and 40 those two entities had swapped their properties. What had been the federal courthouse became the county courthouse, and the feds tore down the old county courthouse and built the new one at Chase and Palafox Street. So things were booming. We were moving along well. To the north of the city, the West Florida Pulp and Paper Company was almost ready to open their new paper making plant at Cantonment, and so people were really moving ahead very well in terms of getting out of the Depression. Our city council had as its mayor Mr. Hagler. Hagler, by the way, also was the manager of the San Carlos Hotel, and the city manager was George Rourke. And these two men, of course, would have a big role, or have joint roles, in what was going to happen to the community in just months ahead. The United States was now in the third year of what we would call today a low-level draft. We had begun drafting young men in the 1939. The intent at that point in time was that these men would be trained. They would be in uniform for about 18 months, and that was going to be it. And of course, we had just begun to develop an armed force that way, because as most of us looking back at history will recognize that through the Depression, the size of our Army and our Navy had certainly shrunk, and our arms of air power and all of the services were just really getting started. We were growing in that area. Well, when we were sitting around here, people were sitting around in Pensacola in early December on a Sunday afternoon, December the 7th, when suddenly, if you happened to be listening to WCO at that point, you were listening to a symphony concert, and suddenly, in the midst of that, an announcer broke in to tell people that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. This was the first, of course, the first word that anyone here got, and immediately people began to respond. I'd like to give you an idea of what a few of these people did, how they reacted to it. One person was a man by the name of Drexel Caldwell. Drexel was a member of the police force and had been for some time. He had been listening to the radio, and he thought, well, I wonder if Chief O'Connell had heard that. He said maybe the police ought to do something quickly to get itself organized just for security basis. So basically, Caldwell got on the telephone and got a hold of Chief O'Connell, and the chief said, thank you very much for doing that. I'm going to start calling people, and I'll give you a list to call as well. We want to assemble the entire force if we possibly can about 5 o'clock this afternoon, and they did. Another man that was involved was a man named Dwight Hufford. Hufford was the assistant plant manager at the Armstrong Core Company plant. He and his family had been listening to the concert, and he had the same thought that Caldwell did. He thought probably the plant manager ought to know this. He may or may not have been listening, so Hufford called the plant manager, Ian Lee, and Lee agreed that something ought to be done. We said, we don't know that this could affect us immediately, but let's be sure, let's try to see if we can get all of the key staff at the plant by about 5 or 5:30 this afternoon, and they did, and proceeded on from there. Another one that got the word from a neighbor was a man named E.P. Nickinson, and Nickinson was he had been a naval officer. He had been a graduate of Annapolis. He had left the service because of a disability, had been called back in not too long before, was on staff at the Naval Air Station. He got the word, and immediately, and the way his family tells it, he hardly said a word to anyone. He simply got up from where he was sitting, went into the bedroom, put on his uniform, and said quietly, I'll be back when I get here. Something has to be done. And Mr. Nickinson, or Commander Nickinson, was on his way. A man in uniform, a man named William Chase, was a part of the staff, was part of the uniformed company at the Naval Air Station. And 2 days before, somehow or other, he had gotten the use of an airplane from the station and had gone up to watch the Army-Navy game. And he was on his way back, and weather forced him to stay overnight somewhere else. So he didn't land in Pensacola at the air station until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He got out, started to get out, and one of the staff came running up to him and said, well, you want to go in and see the commanding officer right away? And of course, Chase said, well, what have I done now? And the man said, you haven't done a thing, but the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. We're all going into an alert situation almost at once. So those are 4 basic ideas of how people reacted, and the entire community, of course, did so. The newspaper came out with a special edition with headlines that big, that paper boys going down the street that night, to alert all of the people that could be reached through that particular medium. Well, as all of this began to move forward, the community began to say, now, wait a minute, how is this going to affect us? What do I do? And of course, the next thing that they learned was that with the next morning's paper, they knew that the President of the United States was going to address the joint session of Congress the next morning at 11 o'clock Central Time, and that everyone wanted to hear that. It was going to be broadcast over WCOA, so just about everyone that could was glued to a radio that day. And this, of course, was when FDR gave what became known in history as his famous is the Day of Infamy speech, of course, which of course called upon the Congress of the United States to react quickly and declare war on the Japanese, which indeed they did. Well, now, as all this happened, the people began to react as was fitting for their own station here. Mayor Hagler and City Manager Rourke quickly put things together at City Hall, calling staff together and saying, well, we've been expecting something like this could happen. We've got to react, taking our cue from the lessons that the British have had, particularly as they were bombed and felt the effects of the Blitz from the Germans. So the first thing Mr. Hagler did was to send out a call asking for volunteers to come in and be trained to serve as air raid wardens. And people said, well, now, some people reacted and said, now, why in the world would they do that? How are they going to bring airplanes over and bomb us? That was not the idea at all. They were concerned about the people showing light, which might be viewed as a kind of make a silhouette out of any activity of ships on the Gulf, because we already knew, the people locally already already knew, or certainly felt sure that they knew, that there had been submarine activities in the Gulf. And Hagler and the others said, all right, if this is a possibility, we don't want to have any light from here silhouetting our own commercial or naval ships out there, so let's start patrolling at night. And so they did. A great number of men, some of them as young as age 16, came in and volunteered, and the very next night they were set up squares on which they would do their work. And this covered all of the lower part of the city. These people came out each night and did their work, and some of them thought that was just a lark and fun, but they did it. And the next thing that Hagler and Rourke began to do was to say, we've got to set up security at key intersections in case we should have problems. We need a home guard that go out there and can be present to direct traffic or what might have to be done at key intersections. And so they began to develop a home guard, which was not terribly different than what the city had during World War I. And so here, old elderly men, people who were very interested in this, and a lot of women stepped forward and said, yes, you can call on us for this sort of thing anytime that you want to, and let's be sure that we're ready if we are needed. At the same time, people like Dwight Hufford and Al Lee with the various industries said, well, we've been working on kind of short shrift all the way through the Depression. We've managed to keep the companies going, but now we can expect that things are going to pick up very quickly because the training efforts of the country are going to require lots more barracks and units to put for barracks and that sort of thing. So all of the industries, that include Newport Industries and of course the New Florida Drum Company, all of them began to work to recruit so that they would have many of people that they would need right on hand here. Now, going beyond that, people began to say, what lessons did we learn in World War I that we might apply it here? So within the next couple of weeks, right after December the 7th, people began to say, no, one thing we're going to have to recognize that food is going to become a weapon. We've got to do everything we can on the farm and in the home and in the bakery and in the restaurant to be sure that we are making the best use of the food resources that we have. A lot of our civic clubs, and by the time World War II came along, we had half a dozen civic clubs like Rotary and Lions and Kiwanis and the others. They immediately called themselves together and said, all right, what can we do to help? There certainly are going to be duties here that we can do. Maybe it's in helping raise funds through bond sales, whatever it is, we are ready. And the same sort of calling came through now, just as it did in World War I, from the American Red Cross, the YMCA, the Knights of Columbus. All of these people responded and said, I don't want to leave out the YMCA. All of these people responded that way, say, what can we do? And each one, of course, had some degree of idea how they might participate. And almost from day one on December the 7th, these people were ready to help as they could. Well, at this point, the idea was, how are we going to respond as a community? And we did. The people said, now, we know that we're going to get more and more traffic in here. We're going to have our police force at the ready. We also know that the Navy is going to have a great expansion here. We can anticipate that. We don't know what's going to happen in our port. Let's do whatever we can to make the port facilities ready. Let's be sure that we've got a steady flow of coal down here to service the coal-burning ships that are going to come in. All of these things are part of what began in the very first couple of weeks. And of course, December the 7th is just a couple of weeks away from Christmas. And the community did not shut down everything because of the war. In other words, people began to say, all right, we're still going to give presents. And they began to recognize that we already had quite a number of men and women in the military who were in uniform, and the people in the churches and in homes said, now, let's be sure we do what we should do and make certain that these people have a home away from home on Christmas Day. And they did. So as we went through the days up to Christmas time, the committee was just literally putting itself together in order to be ready to do whatever it needed to do for its part in World War II. And so the war began. And the Naval Air Station, the activity mushroomed very quickly. And so but by the time we get to the end of the year, Pensacola and its people were ready to do whatever they could do to be a part of winning World War II.